So, hi, everybody. This is Cindy, and it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I'm going to share with you some changes coming to the PMBOK guide. I'm going to be talking about the 7th edition in particular. So, thank you for being here. I see we have several hundred people here, and I know you're calling in from around the world. So, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. I'm on the west coast of the United States, so for me, it's still morning. Anyway, it is great to be here. So I'm going to talk about a couple things. I will be talking about, first of all, why is the 7th edition so different? And then I'll talk about what's the structure of the framework for it, and then I'll dive deep into what content is inside that structure. But of course, before we get going, I have to do a few disclaimers, so bear with me. The first thing I want to do is let you know that I think that the content is finalized, but I can't say for sure it's finalized. I know the direction and the intent are final, but maybe some of the details will be changed. Now, the other thing is there are images in here that are the copyright of PMI. So, and also this content, this presentation is owned by IIL. So I would ask you to respect the copyright. Finally, everything you're going to hear is from me, Cindy. I don't speak for IIL and I don't speak for PMI. Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, let's look at why did PMI decide to make significant changes from the 6th edition to the 7th edition. When I say significant, those of you familiar with the PMBOK guide know it's like 600-700 pages, and there's kind of this joke that says, you know, oh my gosh, there's a new edition. Was it going to be 1,000 pages now? Am I going to need a forklift to lift these things? Well, I'm going to say, this is my guess, it's going to be about 250 pages. So right away, you can see this is not your same PMBOK guide that you're used to. But what led to that change? Well, PMI's board of directors back in 2016, 2017 looked at PMI's strategic plan and said, this is great for the past, but this does not represent where we need to be in the future. And so they did a lot of work on that. I mean, the speed at which technology was advancing, the different types of disruptive, literally disruptive technology. If you think about some of the things that we take for granted now, they weren't around 8 or 10 years ago. So that kind of rapid transformation, organizations need to change and adapt and adjust to that. And projects, by the way, are the way they do that, right? Projects is how change occurs. So the way we deliver projects has to evolve to reflect that rapidly changing market. And so these changes in the strategic plan obviously cascaded throughout PMI, including big changes to the PMBOK guide. So those were some of the reasons for that change. You can see here, this is kind of encapsulate how work is getting done is changing. New advances in technology are disrupting traditional industries, and they're changing the functional roles and responsibilities of workers. Now, before we started the PMBOK guide, and before they start, you know, before they started the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th edition of the PMBOK guide, they went out and did market research to say, how has the profession evolved? What do we need to do to reflect that in the new PMBOK guide? And so I will give you just a summary of some of the feedback we found. First of all, around the globe, the PMBOK guide was definitely well regarded. People considered, yes, you can trust the PMBOK guide. It is a trusted resource. But they also said, and I'm sure this won't be a surprise to any of you, it is a phenomenal sleep aid, but it is really hard to slog through. And by the way, it's pretty out of date. We use this as a resource, but it doesn't represent how we manage projects. And there's, even though the 6th edition started to try and address agile and adaptive ways of doing projects, it was just kind of, it wasn't really integrated into the content. So that was the background research that we had to look at to say, overall, the structure of the PMBOK guide, this reliance on processes, is out of date. It's too predictive. It doesn't represent how we manage projects. And so you can only go on so long continuing the same way before you're irrelevant. And so we needed to reimagine the 7th edition. And so now that we've identified what drove the need for change, let's look at that structure. So in the past, the 6th edition, it tended to say, these are the processes. And there was no intention to be like, you will do this, right? But because it was process oriented and had outputs like a charter, people tended to interpret it as, you should follow these 49 processes. You should have all these outputs. These are the techniques you should use, right? We don't do that in the 7th edition. There are no processes, okay? It talks about principles, and it covers everything from predictive to agile to iterative, hybrid types of projects. So rather than focusing on those inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs that we all know and love, we are focusing on outcomes instead of outputs, okay? We're looking at, how do projects and how do we as project managers or project leads tailor our life cycle, tailor our development approach, tailor what methods and artifacts we use based on the needs of the organization and the project and the product, okay? And as part of that tailoring, the 7th edition actually has a whole section that's devoted to that tailoring approach. The other thing I want to say is that, well, anybody was more than welcome to read the PMBOK guide. I can't imagine why you'd want to if you didn't have to. Really, the primary audience was for project managers. And now the audience is for anyone involved in projects, whether that's a project manager or sponsor or team member, or whether it's a scrum master or product owner or anything like that. So it's really anyone involved with projects is considered the audience for this book. So like previous editions, there's 2 resources in the PMBOK guide. There's the standard and the guide. Now the standard in previous editions was in the back of the book. So probably a lot of people aren't even familiar that there's like a 70 or 80 page standard in the back of the PMBOK guide. It starts around page 550 or something like that. However, so there's still a standard, but this time the standard is going to not be based on processes and inputs and outputs. It'll have principles and a value delivery system. And then there will be the guide to project management. Okay, so like previous editions, there's 2 sections. Only this time the standard will be up front and it'll be much more clearly delineated. So what's in each of those? Well, in the standard, we'll start with an introduction, brief introduction. Then we're going to talk about something called a value delivery system. And I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. I'll talk to you about that. And then project management principles. Then the guide will talk about performance domains rather than knowledge areas. As I mentioned, there'll be a whole section on tailoring. And then there'll be some high-level descriptions of models, methods, and artifacts. So you can see it's very, very different. And this graphic kind of shows you the migration, if you will. So you can see here that in the 6th edition, on the left-hand side, the body of knowledge, the 6th edition was up front, and it had these knowledge areas. And then the standard was in the back, and it was organized by process groups. The 6th edition has the standard up front, and it talks about those things I just said, intro, system for value delivery, and then 12 principles. And then there's the guide to the body of knowledge, which has performance domains, a section on tailoring, then models, methods, and artifacts. Okay, so that's kind of the migration. All right, So now let's take a look in a little bit more detail to see what's in each of those sections. So in the standard, section 1, introduction, system for value delivery and principles. And in section 1, there's a brief few paragraphs on what's the purpose. Then there's some key terms and concepts, and that's short and sweet, but there's 3 new key terms that haven't been used in previous edition. So outcomes, system for value delivery, and even the term value itself. So outcome is an end result or a consequence of a process or project. So outcomes can include outputs, like we had the 6th edition. They can include artifacts, but there's a broader intent with an outcome by focusing on the benefits and the value that the project was undertaken to deliver. So, when we were a younger discipline, there was a lot of focus on, do you have a complete schedule, or is are your requirements, documented in this huge requirements management system? Do you have a quality management plan? And the focus was on all those outputs, the assumption being that if you did a good job on those outputs, your project would be fine. And as you all know, that's, not always true. So there's been a shift in this edition to focus on the outcomes. The outputs are just a means of getting there. The other thing we talk about is a system for value delivery. And when I talk about system for value delivery, it's I'm going to go into that in more detail on the next slide, but basically the glossary definition says a collection of strategic business activities aimed at building, sustaining, or advancing an organization. So portfolios, programs, projects, products, and operations can all be part of an organization's system for value delivery. So if you think about it, right, an organization wants to deliver value, it can do that with projects, it can do that with products, it can do that with programs or portfolios, and it also does that with their operations. So overall, we call this a system for value delivery. And then there's the term value. And when we use the term value, it's not like a value or a value that you hold, like an ethic or a moral value, like, honesty is a value, right? Value is in terms of the worth, importance, or usefulness of something. And there's an understanding that different stakeholders perceive value in different ways. Okay, so those are new terms in the key terms and concepts. And then there's a brief conversation about the audience for the standard. And as I mentioned, the audience is more than just project managers. By the way, I want to say that I know there's questions coming in. I am a project manager, but I cannot split my attention between questions and presenting. So if we have time at the end, I will answer questions. I will go through those. But I do want to let you know I have like a few slides at the end that talk about the relationship of the 7th and the PMP. So I know a lot of you are here, you're interested about that. I'm going to address that at the end. So I just wanted to get that out there so you know I am ignoring you, but not because I'm mean, just because I can't multitask like that. All right. So now in the standard, we have section 2, that system for value delivery. So as I mentioned, you're delivering value. You can do that through a product, service, or result. Organizations can do that through social or environmental contributions. You can increase value by improving efficiency or productivity, right? So the internal system for value delivery, as I mentioned, projects, programs, portfolio, and operations. Another section in this section 2, another part talks about the functions associated with projects. And we often in projects talk about roles and responsibilities, right? So we talk about responsibility assignment matrix. We have different roles: project manager, a sponsor, scrum master, product owner, team member, whatever. And the problem with that is different organizations and different professions might arrange those differently. So there's no way as a standard that we can say, this is what a sponsor does, or this is what a product owner does. We can't say that. But what we can do is we can say that there's numerous functions associated with projects, regardless of a title or job description. Like there's functions associated with identifying or presenting the objectives or getting feedback. There's functions associated with facilitation and support. There's functions associated with actually performing the actual work and applying your subject matter expertise. Providing business direction, providing resources. Those are all functions that are associated with projects. The title of the person that performs those may be different. Okay, so we kind of changed that up in this standard to say what are the key functions. And then we talk about the environment, both internal and external. So your internal environment includes, you know, the process assets you have, the internal knowledge, data that you have internally. Then there's the external environment, marketplace influences, regulations, the physical environment, what's happening, such as, a global quarantine, right? That's an external environment that impacts your project. We are all very familiar with that, I'm sure. And then the last section is a brief discussion about product management, and not so much to go off on a tangent on product management, but more from the perspective, what we're seeing is that more and more the dividing line between projects and products, or products and programs, is starting to blur. So a lot of times you'll see product managers that manage a product line and may do projects associated with that, or the product line may be a program with projects in there. It's those distinctions are less firm now than they have been in the past. And so there's a brief mention of product management in there just to identify that, right? All right, so that's section 2 of the standard. Section 3 is where we talk about the principles, right? So principles are intended to guide the behavior of the people involved. They're very broadly based, so they can apply to organizations, different types of organizations. A principle is not a part of a code of ethics or a code of conduct. They're aligned with and they're complementary to PMI's code of ethics and professional conduct, but they are not the same thing. So what are they? Well, the way the PMBOK guide is using principles is they are considering them a fundamental truth, norm, rule, or value that guides the behavior of those people working on projects, right? Not just PMs, but sponsors and team members as well. It's not how to, it's not like prescriptive. It doesn't say how to do something. It's not a policy or an objective. So let me give you an example so you can kind of understand what I'm saying. And the first thing, before I go over these, there's the principles kind of have a handle, if you will, a label, a principle label, like focus on value or engage with stakeholders. But that's not the whole principle. This text underneath it, this 1 or maybe 2 sentences, encapsulates the principle. So the label, focus on value, we have continually evaluate and adjust project alignment to business objectives and intended benefits and value. For engage with stakeholders, engage stakeholders proactively and to the degree needed to contribute to project success and customer satisfaction. So if you look at these two labels and the principles, you can see how they are like a fundamental value or a fundamental truth in guiding our behavior on any kind of project, whether it's construction, aerospace, software development, process reengineering, whatever the case that is. And they don't tell you how to do that. They just say engage with stakeholders proactively. Do it to the degree that you need. Don't over or underdo it. Just do it to the degree you need for the project to be successful and the customer to be satisfied. So they guide our behavior. How they're employed is dependent on variables in your organization, with your stakeholders for the project and the product, but it would apply to every project, not just, one type of project. And it applies to everybody involved in the project, not just the project manager. So those are the way we're approaching principles, is that they are, universal to everybody involved in the project, and they can apply to any kind of project. So I don't have space or time to give you all the principles, but I do have space or time to show you the labels. So you'll get an idea on the kind of topics, if you will, a topic leader for what the principles cover. So I'm going to be quiet for a minute and let you read through these, and then I'll move on. All right. So I noticed that a few people dropped chats that said slides aren't advancing or there's a problem with audio. So can somebody just chat and let me know if you are seeing slides advance, or if I am not, obviously if there's no audio, you can't hear me. So if you can hear me, can somebody drop a note? Because I want to make sure we're okay here. Yes, we can hear you. Yes. Okay, good. All right. Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody, for the feedback. I get super hyper nervous about this stuff because you just never know these days with all this stuff. And I know I'm not the only one that has that issue, right? We've been in this situation long enough where it's like the most famous phrase of 2020 was, "You're on mute," right? All right, so thanks. All right, so that's everything that's in the standard. Now let's talk about the guide. All right, let's see. Get everything in. Okay, good. So now we're going to talk about the guide. And there's 3 sections in the guide. There's the section on performance domains. There's a section on tailoring, and then a section that covers models, methods, and artifacts. So we'll start with section 1 with performance domains. And let me say, what do I mean performance domain, right? So remember in previous versions of the PMBOK guide, you would hear these things called knowledge areas, and that was a thing, right? There was a definition of what a knowledge area was, and each knowledge area was defined. Domain is used as a generic word to say it's an area of focus. It's just something we focus on, right? So it's not specific. And when we're looking at project domains, we're looking at what are the broad areas of focus for our projects. Like there's a focus on the team, there's a focus on the stakeholders, right? And of course those overlap and they interact, they're interdependent. And performance domains are throughout the project, right? So you don't just like plan once and then not do it. You don't just address stakeholders once and then move on, right? So they occur throughout the project, and they occur regardless of the type of project you're doing, whether you have consistent deliverables on a cadence of every 2 weeks, or you only deliver value at the end of 2 years. These performance domains interact, overlap, and interconnect for each project. And the performance domains have their focus on outcomes, not outputs. In other words, what you want to achieve, not the means by which you will achieve it. So let's look at these. And again, 8 performance domains, right? So I'll be quiet for a minute so you can read. So I think of it like this, kind of like as a project lead, whatever my title is, you know, I'm spending time focused on my stakeholders, internal and external, and including my team. And I'm also thinking about what's the right development approach. Do I have products that can deliver value early? Does everything come together at the end? Am I going to use sprints or time boxes? So that how I develop, what my phases in my life cycle are, I'm thinking about that. Based on that, I might do some planning, but I'm planning throughout the project, especially if I'm working on a project with evolving scope. So you can see each of these interacts, they influence each other. Planning influences uncertainty and my team members and my deliveries and my measurement, right? So they interact, right? We're not saying these are siloed events, right? But we have to talk about them in a silo so we can understand them. So we present them as a domain, but obviously they don't occur in a silo. That it's, you know, as you all know, projects are messy, right? They're just messy. I always think about a project like a big pot of spaghetti. Everything's intertwined with everything else. All right, so let's look at each of these. And first, before we look at the detail, I want to talk about how the performance domains are structured. So every performance domain starts with like this graphic that you see, the stakeholder performance domain. And this is a screenshot that may or may not be in the final edition, but something like this will be in there. And you can see the definition on the left of that. Stakeholder performance domain addresses activities and functions associated with stakeholders. That's pretty logical. And then you can see the outcomes on the other side, right? So there's 3 outcomes that you want: a productive working relationship with stakeholders throughout the project, stakeholder agreement with project objectives. Those stakeholders who are beneficiaries, you want them to support and be satisfied. Those stakeholders who may oppose the project or deliverables, you don't want them to negatively impact your project outcomes. So if you think about that, that would be so for any project, right? Regardless of the type of project you're doing, all these things are so. So in a performance domain, you'll have that table at the top every time. It talks about the performance domain and the desired outcomes. Somewhere towards the top or the beginning of that performance domain, there's going to be some key definitions you might see in there. Like if you're working with uncertainty, you might see definitions of ambiguity or complexities. So key terms might be defined up there. And then there will be a lot of pages, anywhere from like 3 to 12 or 15 pages of domain-specific content. Towards the end of a domain, you're going to have 2 sections. One is common ways that domain might integrate with other performance domains. Obviously, like our bowl of spaghetti, you can't define all of them, but just to give some general ideas on how this performance domain interacts with other performance domains. And then there's this area for checking results. And there was a lot of discussion on whether this should be in there. There's a lot of people who want to say, how do you like evaluate whether you are doing this domain right, or whether you are mature, or how to mature? Like you guys, you know about all these maturity models, right? How can you say that you are satisfactorily meeting the outcomes of this domain or not? And certainly my opinion is that it's not PMI's role to tell you how to do that, because every organization is different, right? So if you or a consultant or a contractor wants to develop a maturity model for each of these to measure effectiveness in an organization, what a great little cottage industry, what a great way to provide value. But PMI is not doing that. But what they are doing is there's an end thing called checking results, which has ways, and the results are those outcomes that you want, those desired outcomes, that says, how would you check to see if you have stakeholder agreement with objectives? Or how would you check to see that there's a productive working relationship? So for every outcome that's identified, every desired outcome, there's ways that you can check that. Are those the only ways? Of course not, but they're just some ideas. So I think one of the things that's important in this 7th edition is that obviously you can't be exhaustive or, complete every possible thing that can be met. But the PMBOK guide can seed ideas that you can then run with and expand on to meet the particular needs of your project and organization. Okay, so that's what's in every single performance domain. So I'm going to go over some of the high points in each domain. So in the stakeholder performance domain, this content covers the type of work that you do when you want to achieve these outcomes. You identify your stakeholders and you do it throughout your project. You try and understand what their needs and beliefs are. You analyze them, and then you may prioritize some stakeholders over other stakeholders. You're going to engage via various communication methods, and then you're going to monitor the effectiveness. And many of you are probably saying, gee, Cindy, that pretty much sounds like what's in the stakeholder engagement knowledge area of the current edition. And you are correct. So let me use this opportunity to emphasize that the 7th edition does not, capital N-O-T, does not negate content in the current edition. It doesn't say it's out of date. It doesn't say it's wrong. It doesn't say any of that. In the past, when we've updated editions, PMI has said, okay, now use this edition. It's updated. It's, more current or whatever. Because there's such a huge shift, this edition is definitely not saying the 6th edition is wrong. So I will continue to use the 6th edition, even though I've worked on the 7th edition. I think the 7th edition is great. And I would use the 7th edition more for high-level ideas. And as we go through this more, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. But the 6th edition I use maybe for more detailed information. Like, for example, I might say, if you're talking about somewhere, if we're talking about, let me think about this, say planning, for planning for uncertainty. Right? So in this domain, it talks about different types of uncertainty, variability, ambiguity, complexity, right? So that's good. I want to think about that. I want to think about where are the areas that there's a lot of volatility, where are the areas where there's a lot of ambiguity, and think about how to do that. So it gives me something to think about. Now, I might use the 6th edition to say, where are some ways I can quantify uncertainty? I might do that. I might go in and say, how's the PMBOK guide defining their different bandwidths between probability and impact? Or, gosh, when should I use some quantitative methods? I might also go to PMI Standards Plus to get some ideas on that. And so Standards Plus is a digital platform, and I'm going to talk about that towards the end. So again, this guide will provide high-level information to get me thinking about stuff, but it's not a how-to. Okay, all right. So that's stakeholder performance domain. Point is, I can find out more information if I want to access the 6th or some other stuff on Standards Plus. All right, next performance domain, my team performance domain. And again, you might see some overlap in concepts between the develop project team and manage project team in the resource knowledge area for the 6th edition. But there's some other cool stuff here, like team culture. It talks about team culture. It talks about what do you need for high-performing teams? What are the interpersonal skills or leadership skills that you should bring? How do you tailor your leadership skills? So these are all good things to think about when we're thinking about our team and how to effectively work with our team. Now we've got this thing called development approach and life cycle performance domain. And this is a really interesting one. I know for me personally, I worked in project management for a very long time before I could separate the meaning and understanding of development approach and life cycle and delivery cadence. Some people that work in system engineering or other types of disciplines, it may be obvious, but for me it wasn't. So when we talk about this, the development approach is basically, are you going to use like an agile type thing where you're doing time box deliveries and you're delivering value on a set, cadence? Are you going to use a development approach like that that allows the project or the product to evolve? Maybe another development approach is iterative. Maybe another one's incremental, where you develop different components, then you integrate them at the end. Maybe your development approach is a lot of big planning up front and then a big delivery at the end, more of a waterfall approach, right? So that's the development approach. Delivery cadence is how frequently you deliver value or you deliver products or roll things out. And it may be rapidly, it may be just at the end, it may be periodically. So the development approach and the delivery cadence fit within the life cycle phases in your project. So your phases have to reflect how you're going to develop your product and how often you're going to deliver value, right? And so that's talked about in this domain. And again, I think for me, that was one of the more challenging ones to wrap my head around when I was a project manager. So I'm hoping that this content will help people that are new to the profession. All right, so that's in that performance domain. And then, of course, there's a performance domain for planning, right? And so there's an overview, and then we talk about the variables that impact planning and the team structure. And then there's planning, planning for the team, planning for communications, planning for your physical resources, procurement, how will you manage change, what are the right metrics, etc. And obviously, as we know, planning takes place throughout the project, as does this performance domain. And then there's project work. And the way I think about this is, in the current edition of the PMBOK guide, we talk about project scope and product scope. Project work is like the project scope, right? So how do you balance the competing constraints? How are you communicating within the project? How are you managing physical resources? How are you working with procurements? Those are all project work that enables or empowers the deliveries, the actual physical deliverables you're working on. So in this domain, we're talking about deliverables like scope and requirements, and we talk about quality, right? And the cost of quality and cost of change. Another thing we're talking about, and I kind of like this, if you look under deliverables, you'll see this moving target of completion. And this can show up in different ways depending on your development approach. If you're using a waterfall or predictive method, right, we look at that as scope creep, right? So more scope gets added without more schedule getting added or more budget, right? So that's a moving target to get to done, right? Another way of looking at it is in a more agile or adaptive environment. If you keep adding requirements to the backlog, you're never going to finish, right? So, whether you call that, done drift or moving targets of completion, you can address it from either perspective. The other thing that this project covers is suboptimal outcomes. So sometimes we actually don't achieve the intended outcomes of the project. So we talk a little bit about that. And then there's measures. And so in here, we're going to talk about KPIs, measurements. What do you measure? What are some common measures for deliverables and baselines and business value and forecasts? And then we talk about, different ways of presenting it, whether you're going to use, information radiators or dashboards or visual controls. And then there's some conversation about measurement pitfalls and troubleshooting. Okay, so that's all in measurement. And then the last domain I'll talk about is uncertainty. And in the 6th edition, we kind of focused on risk, and risk was getting so out of control, it was like going to eat the world, right? And that's fine, because there's a lot of really good information on risk. But we're actually taking a step back and saying it's not just risk. I mean, when we define risk in the PMBOK guide, there's certainly the word uncertainty in there. Risk is an uncertain event or condition, right? But we're calling this uncertainty, and we'll talk about general uncertainty, ambiguity, complexity, volatility, right? So those of you that are familiar with VUCA, you'll see that: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. All of these are associated with uncertainty, including risk. So these concepts are addressed in this performance domain. And again, going back to the example I used, here you would look at the different types of uncertainty that might be on your project and think about them. And then you might find in Standards Plus or the 6th edition or any other resource, do a web search, buy a book, whatever, find more detailed information on how to apply that. Okay, all right. That's the performance domains. Next section in the guide is on tailoring. And while in previous editions, we've emphasized the need to tailor, in fact, it's all over there where it says tailor this to meet the needs of your project. Here, we've introduced what I'd call a lightweight tailoring model. It takes into consideration the development approach you're using, right? So are you doing incremental? Are you doing an agile? So first, look at how you're going to develop to figure out how to tailor your deliverables, your models, your methods, your artifacts. Then take a look at the organization, right? So do I have a top-down organization? Do I have a very flat organization? Is it hierarchical? Is it command control, or is it more organic? So I can tailor based on that. And then I can tailor based on the project. So is my project team co-located? Are they spread out? Do I have a very life-critical product, or is it, you know, a game? And I know some of us think that games can be life-critical, but they aren't. And then kind of doing ongoing inspection and adaptation. So the topics in that section, right? So we look at ideas for how to select the development approach, and then, as I said, how to tailor for the organization, the project, and then obviously ongoing improvement. So what needs to change? Is this working? Can we tweak it? And then there's a section on tailoring each performance domain. So questions that you would ask, or things to take into consideration when tailoring concepts or ideas in each performance domain. Okay, so I think that's great because it's more guidance on tailoring than we've given in the past. All right, now we're going to look at models, methods, and artifacts. So let me start with the definition. So a model is like a framework. It's a way to think about something. A method is a means for achieving an outcome. So tools and techniques are both methods, right? An artifact can be a template, it can be a document, it can be an output, it can be a deliverable, right? So we're going to look at different models, methods, and artifacts. Now, the content presented in this section is by no means complete. It could never be complete because new stuff is coming out all the time, right? It's just examples of models, methods, and artifacts that we frequently use on projects, but it is not rating them and saying one is better than the other. It's not. It also doesn't describe how to use various models, methods, and artifacts, right? So it literally is like, especially when it's a brief description. So if you read something about a model in there and you say this makes sense, then go do some more research on it. It doesn't provide that research. It doesn't tell you how to use a certain tool. It doesn't give you a template for a certain artifact. Again, some of the information on Standards Plus might have that, or just a internet search or any other book that you might have would provide information on that. So we'll take a look at models, right? So there's 6 different categories of models and things, and then there's other that kind of holds those things. Anything in these 6: situational leadership, communication, motivation, change, complexity, and team development. Any model in there, there's at least 2 and sometimes maybe more models that talk about it. So there's different ways to think about it. Okay. Other, we have, it's kind of a collection of hodgepodge, like conflict, negotiation, planning, and even the process groups. Because if you think about the process groups or a model, they're a way, a framework we can think about project management. So those are listed as a model in here. So that's models. And then we have methods. So methods are the means by which we accomplish work. So there's, 3 main categories, and then other. And other includes modeling, prioritization, time boxing, impact mapping, and net promoter score. But as you can imagine, there's a ton of stuff in methods for gathering and analyzing data, benchmarking, root cause analysis, forecasting. So if you're in a situation where you need to collect and analyze data, how you would use this is you can go there and look, and you can say, oh my God, look at these 17 different ways I can do it. What will work for my project? And some of it may just be, a nudge like, oh yeah, I could do that, right? And then you go apply it. Some of you may say, what the heck is that? And that tells you, oh, why don't you go do some more research and figure out what it is. There's different ways of estimating. So, we've always kind of leaned on analogous, parametric, 3-point estimating, some people Delphi, but now we've added in, the wideband Delphi and affinity grouping and relative estimating and things like that. And then there's meetings and events. And so I think this will be useful, like if you, primarily come from a predictive background, you might find something about looking at stand-up meetings or retrospectives or demos, right? And if you come from a adaptive perspective, you might say, oh, that's what they do in those whatever planning meetings or status meetings or whatever. So there's different meetings and events that are listed. And then we have a section on artifacts, and there's a bunch of different categories here. So for strategy artifacts, well, artifacts are like I said, outputs, forms, reports, templates, etc. And so strategy artifacts, business case, roadmap, vision statement, all those are strategy artifacts. Logs and registers, you might see your assumption log or a risk-adjusted backlog and other types of registers. Plans, this is pretty, a release plan and communications management plan. Hierarchy chart refers to anything like a WBS or a risk breakdown structure, or product breakdown structure, anytime you've got that kind of org chart structure. And then our baselines, whether it's a performance measurement baseline or a schedule baseline budget. Visual data and information, affinity diagrams, burn charts, responsibility assignment matrix, network diagram. These are all artifacts that present a graphic view of information. And then you have various reports, a status report or risk report, agreements and contracts. And then in the other section here, we've got user stories. They don't really fall within here, but they're important. Requirements documentation, a team charter, something like that. So that's artifacts. So let me show you how this fits together. So if you are starting with your principles of project management that guide your behavior, and as you can see in the orange box, everything you do is going to be tailored to fit the project context. That includes your performance domains. Various models or methods you may use as you are in, managing your projects in various performance domains. You'll use those things in order to what? Create deliverables and artifacts. And all this takes place within a system for value delivery, right? Projects, programs, products in an internal environment of an organization, which is part of that larger external environment. So that's kind of the big picture. Okay, now I'm going to branch out from the PMBOK guide, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the PMP. And those of you who are primarily there for that, you will probably not be as satisfied as you'd like, but I'm sorry, I will do the best I can. So how does this fit with the PMP? The first thing I'm going to say is that some people are aware of, a lot of people who train are aware of, but a lot of people who just want to take the PMP are not aware that the exam is developed. The first thing in developing exam is you do what's called a role delineation study, right? So they interview tens of thousands, many, many thousands of project managers to say, what roles, what tasks do you do in your work? And that, they take all that information and consolidate it into what's called an exam content outline. And that exam content outline has domains. They're different than the domains we have in the PMBOK guide, and tasks and enablers. And the PMP and the CAP-M and any other exam that PMI puts together is based on this exam content outline. It is not based on the PMBOK guide. Okay, it's not based on the PMBOK guide. It is based on an exam content outline. And in fact, the standards department and the certification department are two separate departments. All right. So an example, as I said, they have domains, tasks, and enablers. So a domain is a high-level knowledge area. Notice that the domains will be different, right? So they are business, process, and people domains, right? And within there's a task. In other words, what's the PM's responsibility? And enablers say, for example. So let me forward this and talk you through an example. So within the people domain, one of the tasks is managing conflict. So as a project manager, we are expected to manage conflict. Enablers that help us to manage conflict are interpreting the source of the conflict and the stage. Is it in the beginning or is it very advanced? Where are we? Analyzing the context for the conflict. How did this come about? Why did this happen? And then evaluating, recommending, reconciling the conflict, okay? Helping to identify a resolution strategy or solution. So that is part of the exam content outline. That's the domain, the task, and the enablers, okay? You can see nothing in there is in conflict with any of the PMBOK guides. It's also not directly aligned to. So the PMP is different than the PMBOK guide. So let's talk about the new PMP that was just launched in January. The exam, when they are developing an exam and the exam questions, the people writing the questions are, project managers, and they have to be able to identify at least two sources that they can say, this is how I got the question, the answer. And those sources, by the way, are listed on PMI's website. So the 6th edition is one of the many sources. I think there's 10, 12, 13 sources or something like that, right? The 2021 PMP integrates Agile into it, so probably the Agile Practice Guide is another resource. The 7th edition has not been finalized. It's not out to print. Therefore, certification hasn't seen the content. Therefore, it is not a resource for the current PMP. Okay, it is not a resource for the current PMP. Some people say that once the PMBOK guide is updated, that triggers an update for the PMP. And given that the PMP just released in January, it's probably not going to trigger that. What triggers it is a new role delineation study. So there is no date by which content in the 7th edition will be showing up on the test. In other words, there is no date by which the 7th edition will be a resource for studying for the PMP. So for PMP prep, your best bet is to work with an authorized training provider like IIL to take classes on PMP prep or whatever. Review the exam content outline, which you can get on pmi.org in certification/PMP. There's all those resources there. And look at the other resources to prepare, okay? So that is my best advice to you for the PMP. I think you should get the 7th edition because it's a really good resource, but it is not necessarily a resource for the PMP. Now, the other question that people often have is, when, Cindy, is this thing going to be out? PMI has been saying it's going to be out, it's coming, and yet we do not know when. And I will tell you, sadly, I don't know when either. I talked to the product owner for the PMBOK guide on Monday at PMI, and he said, I cannot tell you anything, but Cindy, what I can tell you is if you go to pmi.org/standards-projects, that is where all the latest information is about standards, including the 6th edition. And when there is a date by which it will be released, it will be on that page. And I said, well, Marv, thanks a lot, but I already knew all that. He says, well, and I said, look, I'm giving a webinar. I got to be able to tell these people something other than it's coming in 2021. He says, I get it. And he said, look, tell people, check that once a week. And by the way, it would be a good idea to check it at the end of this week. So this leads me to believe that there is probably in the coming days going to be some kind of information listed on there for when this thing will be released, but I don't know the date. And believe me, I wish I did, because it is frustrating to me as well, but I don't. All right, that's what I've got, and I've taken the whole time. I don't have time for questions. What I will say is that so I will type in, you can always find me on LinkedIn, right? So Cynthia Snyder, Dionisio, you can drop me a note there and whatever, ask questions or follow me or whatever, that's great. I do want to thank IIL for hosting this. And you can see here, they do a lot of work in leadership and innovation and Agile and Scrum and everything like that. So this is IIL's email learning and their website and everything. So give them a shout, check them out. Great training, great company, all that stuff. And I just want to say thanks for being here and listening. I hope you found some value in that. And I appreciate your time. So have a wonderful day wherever you are on the planet and be safe.